What if the greatest threat to world peace was never an alien army, a mad scientist, or some superpowered tyrant standing on a battlefield? What if the real danger was the system humanity had created to protect itself? That is the uncomfortable question sitting underneath Captain America. The Winter Soldier, a movie that looks like a conventional superhero sequel until you realize it is actually telling a much darker story about power, fear, surveillance, and the moment a hero discovers that the institution he trusted has become the enemy. Captain America was originally designed as a symbol of uncomplicated American ideals: courage, sacrifice, honesty, and the belief that doing the right thing mattered, even when doing the right thing was difficult. But in this film, Steve Rogers wakes up decades after the world he knew has disappeared, only to discover that liberty has been redefined. The modern answer to danger is no longer waiting for evil to reveal itself. It is identifying potential threats before they act, watching millions of people, collecting information, and deciding who might become dangerous tomorrow. And somehow, the organization built to keep humanity safe has become the perfect weapon for that philosophy. S.H.I.E.L.D. was supposed to be the ultimate protective shield, an institution capable of defending the world from threats no ordinary government could handle. Yet beneath its polished headquarters, advanced technology, and heroic mission statement, something poisonous has survived for 70 years. Hydra did not disappear when Steve Rogers defeated the organization during World War II. It adapted. It buried itself inside bureaucracy, intelligence networks, political institutions, and the machinery of modern security. That makes the conspiracy so disturbing, because nobody needs to conquer S.H.I.E.L.D. from the outside. The enemy has already learned how to operate from within. The very system designed to identify threats has become the mechanism through which those threats can be manufactured, categorized, and eliminated. And at the center of this nightmare is Steve Rogers, a man whose greatest strength suddenly becomes his greatest weakness. He believes people deserve freedom because he remembers a time when freedom demanded sacrifice. The world around him believes freedom can be preserved through enough surveillance, enough weapons, and enough predictive power. Steve sees human beings. The system sees probabilities. He sees choices. Project Insight sees targets. That difference becomes the battlefield. The most devastating part is that Steve is not fighting an army he can punch. He is fighting an idea. He is fighting the seductive belief that safety is worth any sacrifice, even the sacrifice of innocence, privacy, trust, and eventually free will. And once the film reveals just how deeply Hydra has embedded itself into the machinery of protection, the question changes completely. This is no longer simply a story about whether Captain America can stop the bad guys. It becomes a story about whether one man can still recognize right from wrong when the people telling him what is right have all the authority, all the weapons, and all the information. That is why The Winter Soldier remains so unsettling. Beneath the shield, the explosions, and the superhero mythology is an anti-establishment thriller asking a frighteningly simple question. When the system designed to protect freedom decides that freedom itself is the threat, who protects us from the system? To understand why The Winter Soldier works so remarkably well, we have to look beyond the obvious surface. Yes, this is a Marvel superhero movie. Yes, there are helicarriers, assassins, impossible escapes, and enough destruction to fill an entire summer blockbuster. But the movie's real achievement is the way it disguises a political espionage thriller inside the machinery of a shared cinematic universe. Instead of simply increasing the scale of the previous Captain America story, Marvel changed the genre surrounding him. Steve Rogers went from fighting Nazis in a World War II adventure to fighting corruption inside a modern intelligence agency. And that transition forced the character to confront a completely different kind of enemy. So this breakdown will follow that transformation from several directions. We will begin with the film's production origins, examining why Marvel took an enormous gamble by placing Anthony and Joe Russo, directors best known at the time for television comedy, behind one of the studio's most important superhero projects. We will also explore Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely's adaptation of Ed Brubaker's influential comic book work, particularly the controversial decision to bring Bucky Barnes back into Steve's life decades after his apparent death. From there, we will move through the film itself, breaking down its narrative structure from Steve's first meeting with Sam Wilson to the Lemurian star rescue, Nick Fury's attempted assassination, the elevator fight, the discovery of Hydra's infiltration, the revelation of Bucky's identity, and the final battle above Washington. But this will not simply be a recap. Each major sequence reveals something about the characters and the world they inhabit. The action is not merely decoration. The way Steve fights tells us how he thinks. The way Natasha lies tells us how she survives. The way Pierce speaks tells us how institutional evil can hide behind politeness. And the way Bucky moves tells us what happens when a human being is reduced to a weapon. We will then examine the film's psychology, themes, visual language, music, sound design, practical stunt work, and directorial style. The goal is to understand why the movie feels so different from the superhero films surrounding it. Its influences stretch back to paranoid thrillers of the 1970s, films built around government conspiracies, compromised institutions, surveillance, and protagonists who cannot trust the people around them. The Russos translated those ideas into the language of the MCU without making the movie feel like a lecture. Finally, we will step outside the film and examine its cultural and industry impact. Released in 2014, The Winter Soldier arrived during a period of growing anxiety about surveillance, government secrecy, drone warfare, and the enormous power of data. More than a decade later, its central questions about predictive technology and institutional trust feel even more relevant. That is what makes this movie worth revisiting. Its importance is not simply that it was a successful Marvel sequel. It demonstrated that a franchise blockbuster could change genres, challenge its own mythology, and still remain emotionally intimate. And once Marvel discovered that formula, the entire cinematic universe would never be quite the same again. There is a particular feeling that comes with watching The Winter Soldier again after all these years. It is partly nostalgia, but it is not nostalgia for a simpler movie. It is nostalgia for a moment when superhero cinema still seemed capable of surprising us with what it could become. In 2014, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was already enormous, but it had not yet reached the cultural saturation that would define the years ahead. Audiences had experienced the cosmic spectacle of the Avengers, the technological personality of Iron Man, and the mythological scale of Thor. Superhero movies could be funny, colorful, enormous, and increasingly interconnected. Then Captain America returned, and suddenly the language changed. Steve Rogers was no longer simply swinging a shield like a living symbol from another era. He was throwing punches with the speed and brutality of a modern close-quarters fighter. His shield became less like a theatrical prop and more like a tactical weapon. Fights were messy. Bodies hit walls. Cars crumpled. Knives came within inches of faces. The camera stayed close enough to make every impact feel physical. For audiences accustomed to larger-than-life superhero choreography, that difference was immediate. The movie did not ask us to admire Steve from a distance. It placed us inside the danger with him. And the timing mattered. The film arrived in the shadow of the Edward Snowden revelations, during an era when public conversations about government surveillance, metadata collection, intelligence agencies, and drone warfare had made the idea of invisible power deeply uncomfortable. The Winter Soldier obviously transforms those issues into comic book mythology, but the emotional connection was unmistakable. Project Insight represented a fantasy of total prevention. If technology could watch everyone, analyze everyone, and eliminate threats before they emerged, perhaps humanity could finally become safe. But the film understands the terrifying implication hidden inside that promise. The more perfectly a system predicts danger, the more willing it becomes to treat people as dangers before they have actually done anything. That is why the movie feels more grounded than many of its contemporaries despite containing flying aircraft and superhuman soldiers. The fantasy is not really about the technology. It is about the fear behind the technology. Steve's discomfort feels recognizable because his central question is recognizable. How much freedom are we willing to surrender in exchange for feeling safe? And that question has only become more interesting with time. Rewatching The Winter Soldier now means watching a movie that accidentally became more relevant as technology became more powerful. Computers may look dated. Some visual effects may reveal their 2014 origins. But the paranoia remains remarkably fresh. The film understood that the most frightening enemy does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as convenience, protection, efficiency, and certainty. That is why this is more than another chapter in the Infinity Saga. It is a snapshot of a changing culture. A superhero movie that looked backward to classic espionage cinema, while looking forward to anxieties that would define the digital age. And once we understand the world that produced it, the gamble Marvel took in making this film becomes even more fascinating. The strangest part of The Winter Soldier's production history is that, on paper, its directors did not look like the obvious choice. Anthony and Joe Russo were not established action auteurs with decades of experience commanding giant explosions, military hardware, and visual effects armies. Their reputation was built largely through television comedy, including Community and Arrested Development. For a studio preparing one of its most expensive superhero sequels, that could have looked like a dangerous gamble. Instead, Marvel saw something different. The Russos understood rhythm, character interaction, genre parody, ensemble storytelling, and perhaps most importantly, how to make a large number of moving parts feel coherent. Their work on Community was especially revealing. The famous paintball episodes demonstrated that they could take the visual grammar of an action movie and reproduce it with intelligence, timing, and personality. Those episodes were funny, but the comedy depended on real cinematic instincts. Geography, escalation, suspense, visual callbacks, and carefully controlled chaos. The Russos understood that action only becomes exciting when the audience knows where everyone is and why the moment matters. Marvel paired that sensibility with writers Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, who had already developed a strong understanding of Steve Rogers through the first Avenger. Their challenge was enormous. The first film had established Captain America as a World War II hero whose morality was shaped by sacrifice and duty. The sequel needed to move him into the 21st century without turning him into a completely different character. The solution was to change the world around Steve rather than changing Steve himself. That philosophy connected directly to Ed Brubaker's influential Captain America comics. Brubaker's 2005 run had shocked readers by resurrecting Bucky Barnes and transforming him into the Winter Soldier, a Soviet-controlled assassin haunted by fragments of his former identity. Bringing Bucky back was controversial because the character had long been treated as one of the classic comic book heroes, whose death represented the end of an era. But the storyline discovered something powerful in that taboo. Bucky's return was not simply a resurrection twist. It gave Steve Rogers a physical embodiment of his past. The film adaptation refined that idea for cinema. Instead of making Bucky's return a simple surprise, the screenplay turned him into the emotional center of Steve's conflict. Every conspiracy, every chase, and every revelation eventually leads back to one question. What happens when the past you thought you had lost comes back wearing the face of an enemy? The Russos reportedly approached the project with the language of political and crime thrillers, rather than conventional superhero spectacle. Their influences included films such as The French Connection, 3 Days of the Condor, and Heat, and those influences are visible in the finished movie's priorities. The camera often stays close to the characters. Information is treated as dangerous. Cars become weapons. Buildings become traps. A conversation can be as threatening as a firefight. The film is interested in people who do not know whom to trust. That approach solved another major problem. How do you make Captain America feel relevant in a modern world without abandoning the ideals that define him? The answer was to place those ideals under pressure. Steve does not suddenly become cynical because he wakes up in the 21st century. Instead, the 21st century forces him to discover how difficult his principles are to maintain when the institutions around him have changed. This is what made the production gamble work. Marvel did not hire the Russos to make a bigger version of the first Avenger. They hired them to challenge the assumptions of the franchise. The result was a movie where the superhero was almost secondary to the thriller structure surrounding him. Steve Rogers still had the shield, the strength, and the iconic costume. But now he was operating inside a story built around secrets, surveillance, infiltration, betrayal, and political paranoia. The transition was risky because it could have alienated audiences expecting a straightforward superhero sequel. Instead, it gave Captain America a new dramatic dimension. He was no longer simply a man from the past trying to understand the present. He became a moral outsider inside the modern world. Someone whose old-fashioned principles suddenly made him more radical than the people around him. And that is the key to understanding why Marvel's decision worked. The Russos did not modernize Captain America by making him less idealistic. They modernized him by making idealism dangerous. Before the Winter Soldier arrived, Captain America still carried a reputation that Marvel had spent years trying to reshape. Steve Rogers was undeniably popular, but compared with Tony Stark, he could appear almost painfully sincere. Iron Man could insult people, improvise, flirt, make jokes, and openly question authority. Captain America represented duty, discipline, sacrifice, and moral certainty. To some viewers, that made him admirable. To others, it made him feel old-fashioned. That perception created what might be called the Boy Scout problem. How do you build a compelling modern thriller around a protagonist who genuinely believes in doing the right thing? In a post-9/11 cultural landscape filled with complicated debates about military intervention, intelligence agencies, terrorism, surveillance, and preemptive force, simple heroism could easily feel naive. Marvel's answer was not to make Steve less sincere. It was to put him inside a system that sincerely believed it was protecting the world while doing things Steve considered morally unacceptable. Suddenly, his straightforward worldview became dramatically useful. When Nick Fury presents Project Insight as the next evolution of global security, Steve does not respond with technological awe. He responds with suspicion. That conflict gave the marketing campaign a clear identity. The trailers emphasized the elevator fight, the highway chase, the Winter Soldier's mysterious presence, and the increasingly ominous atmosphere surrounding S.H.I.E.L.D. Rather than selling the film purely as another colorful chapter of the MCU, Marvel sold it as something harder, faster, and more dangerous. The elevator sequence was particularly important because it communicated the film's new physical language almost instantly. Steve is surrounded by armed agents in a confined space, and instead of using flashy superhero powers to escape, he fights through the room with brutal efficiency. The sequence feels less like a comic book battle than a scene from a martial arts thriller. It tells the audience that this Captain America is not going to fight the way previous superhero movies expected him to fight. Then there was the highway sequence. The trailers showed vehicles being destroyed, gunfire tearing through asphalt, and a masked figure with a metal arm moving with terrifying precision. The mystery surrounding the Winter Soldier became one of the campaign's strongest assets. Who was he? Why was he strong enough to challenge Captain America? Why did Steve seem emotionally affected by him? At the same time, the political atmosphere surrounding the release gave the story additional resonance. The public debate over NSA surveillance and the Snowden disclosures had made the question of government secrecy impossible to ignore. The film's fictional Project Insight was obviously exaggerated for dramatic purposes, but its underlying idea was simple enough to recognize. If governments possess enough information, enough technology, and enough authority, what prevents protection from becoming control? The genius of the marketing was that it promised action while quietly selling paranoia. Viewers came expecting a superhero sequel. They were being prepared for a conspiracy thriller. And that distinction mattered because the film's greatest surprise was not that Captain America could win a fight. Everyone already knew that. The surprise was that Marvel was willing to let Captain America question the institution that had employed him. The shield, traditionally a symbol of protection, suddenly became a symbol of resistance. That was the pivot. Instead of asking whether Steve could protect S.H.I.E.L.D., the movie asked whether S.H.I.E.L.D. deserved his protection. The answer would change everything. The film begins with one of its smartest choices. It does not open with an explosion. It opens with Steve Rogers running. He moves through Washington with effortless speed, repeatedly passing a much slower Sam Wilson and casually delivering the same line every time. On your left. The joke is simple, but its purpose is deeper. Steve is still physically extraordinary, yet emotionally he is searching for connection. Sam is a stranger at first, but their repeated encounters create an immediate sense of warmth and familiarity. In a movie about surveillance, betrayal, and institutional paranoia, this tiny human interaction becomes surprisingly important. Steve is not merely running laps around the city. He is trying to find a place inside it. That search quickly transitions into the Lemurian Star Rescue mission, where the film reveals what modern Captain America looks like in combat. Gone is the relatively straightforward brawling of his World War II battles. Steve now moves like someone who has spent years studying contemporary close-quarters combat. He closes distance aggressively, uses his shield as both defense and offense, redirects weapons, exploits opponents' momentum, and constantly changes angles. The choreography communicates character. Steve does not fight like a man who enjoys violence. He fights like a soldier who wants the fight finished as efficiently as possible. Every movement has purpose. The mission also introduces Natasha Romanoff's contrasting approach. Black Widow operates through deception, disguise, manipulation, and improvisation. Steve operates through directness. He wants to know what the mission is, why they are doing it, and whether the people around him are telling the truth. Natasha is comfortable with holding information if it gets the job done. That difference becomes impossible to ignore when Steve discovers that Natasha has been secretly downloading data from the ship. To her, the operation is simply another layer of intelligence work. To Steve, it represents a breach of trust. The mission may have been successful, but success does not erase the ethical question. This tension leads directly into Nick Fury's presentation of Project Insight. 3 enormous helicarriers are being prepared to operate as a global security system, capable of identifying and neutralizing threats before they happen. To Fury, the project represents the future. The world has become too dangerous to wait for attacks. Technology can predict danger, and force can eliminate it before innocent people are killed. Steve sees something else. He sees a system that has replaced judgment with prediction. The distinction is crucial. Traditional heroism assumes that a person must choose to do something wrong before punishment is justified. Project Insight reverses that principle. It asks whether technology can identify someone who might become dangerous and eliminate the problem before the choice is ever made. For Steve Rogers, that is not security. It is fear disguised as efficiency. And for the first time, the man carrying the shield begins to realize that the institution behind him may be moving in a direction he cannot follow. Steve's disagreement with Nick Fury establishes the film's central ideological fracture. Fury believes the world has changed and security must change with it. Steve understands that argument, but he refuses to accept its conclusion. His objection is not that threats are imaginary. He knows better than anyone that threats are real. His objection is to the idea that fear should determine the limits of freedom. The tension between them is captured in Steve's blunt response. "This isn't freedom. This is fear." That line becomes the moral foundation of everything that follows. Fury soon discovers that the danger is not theoretical. While investigating the origins of Project Insight, he realizes that S.H.I.E.L.D. itself has been compromised. Suddenly, the enormous intelligence network he commands becomes a trap. His enemies know where he is, what he is doing, and how he thinks. The resulting street ambush is one of the film's defining action sequences, because it turns Washington into a battlefield. Fury's armored SUV becomes a moving fortress under siege. Attackers emerge from multiple directions. Heavy weapons tear into the vehicle. The city becomes a maze of obstacles, civilians, traffic, and blind corners. But the real terror arrives when Fury realizes that conventional weapons are not enough. The Winter Soldier appears almost like a ghost. He is not introduced with a grand speech or dramatic declaration. He simply moves through the chaos with frightening calm. His cybernetic arm catches bullets and crushes metal. His face remains obscured. His movements are precise, economical, almost mechanical. Fury survives long enough to reach Steve's apartment, but the warning he delivers changes the entire story. S.H.I.E.L.D. is compromised. Trust no one. The agency Steve serves may be hunting him next. Then the Winter Soldier arrives. The attack is brutal precisely because it feels personal. Fury's supposed death is not presented as a conventional superhero defeat. It is an assassination executed by someone who knows how to make a human being disappear. Steve is left with a mysterious flash drive and an impossible choice. Trust the agency that raised him into its ranks or trust the dying warning of the man who led it. He chooses uncertainty. Steve hides the drive in a hospital vending machine, an almost absurdly ordinary object that suddenly becomes part of a massive conspiracy. The contrast is deliberate. This enormous conflict over global security is now being carried inside everyday spaces. Apartments, hospitals, streets, parking lots. Steve has officially become a fugitive. And that is where the movie's central transformation begins. The shield that once represented service to the United States now represents resistance against an institution operating under the American flag. Alexander Pierce summons Steve to SHIELD headquarters, presenting himself as a reasonable authority figure who simply wants answers. But Steve has already learned that authority and morality are no longer synonymous. When he refuses to reveal everything he knows, the conversation becomes a trap. Then the elevator doors close. The elevator fight works because the Russos understand that limitation creates excitement. There is nowhere to run. No open battlefield. No convenient distance. Steve is surrounded by trained agents in a narrow metal box. The choreography uses the confined space intelligently, turning walls, railings, and the elevator floor into extensions of the combat. Steve's shield becomes especially important because it allows him to control space. He can block one attacker while striking another. He can bounce the shield against the walls. He can create openings by forcing opponents to react to its movement. But the real thrill comes from the rhythm. Steve does not overwhelm everyone instantly. He absorbs attacks, studies the environment, adjusts, and then explodes into action. The sequence reveals that his greatest weapon is not strength. It is experience. Once the elevator becomes impossible to contain, Steve changes strategy. He escapes through the elevator shaft and emerges into the headquarters, effectively declaring that the rules have changed. His escape continues outside, where he uses his motorcycle and shield to disable a pursuing Quinjet. The imagery is important. Steve is literally breaking through the machinery of the organization that once gave him orders. He reconnects with Natasha, and their relationship begins to change. Initially, they are opposites. She is comfortable with secrets. He is uncomfortable with them. She treats deception as survival. He treats honesty as principle. But surviving together forces them to understand one another. Their banter provides levity, yet it also becomes a mechanism for trust. Natasha begins revealing pieces of herself she normally keeps hidden. Steve, meanwhile, learns that her secrecy does not necessarily mean betrayal. Sometimes it means she has learned to survive in a world where openness can be dangerous. Their investigation eventually leads them to Camp Lehigh, the birthplace of Steve Rogers as a symbol. It is one of the film's most haunting locations because the place that represents his past now contains evidence of a conspiracy stretching into his present. Inside the facility, they encounter the preserved consciousness of Arnim Zola. What was once a human scientist has become information stored and waiting inside an enormous computer system. Zola explains that Hydra did not die after World War II. It infiltrated SHIELD, exploiting bureaucracy, political fear, and institutional expansion. The revelation changes the meaning of everything Steve has experienced. The enemy was never simply hiding inside the system. The enemy learned how to become the system. Zola's revelation is terrifying because it transforms Hydra from a defeated organization into a philosophy of institutional survival. It did not need to win another war. It simply needed to wait. It embedded itself inside the machinery created to fight threats, then allowed that machinery to grow larger, more sophisticated, and more dependent on fear. The implication is chilling. Every crisis becomes useful. Every new threat justifies another expansion of power. Every frightened population becomes more willing to surrender freedom for protection. Hydra does not need humanity to become evil. It only needs humanity to become afraid. Before Steve and Natasha can process the revelation, the bunker is destroyed by a shield missile. They escape with their lives but lose the safety of secrecy. Now they need someone outside the compromised system. That person is Sam Wilson. Sam's introduction as Falcon is deliberately grounded. He is not another billionaire genius or mythological warrior. He is a veteran dealing with his own memories and losses, someone who understands what it means to return from conflict and discover that civilian life has continued without you. That makes him an immediate emotional match for Steve. Their partnership grows naturally because Sam does not treat Steve as a legend. He treats him like a person. When the group captures Jasper Sitwell, the conspiracy becomes even larger. The information extracted from him points directly toward Project Insight and the terrifying scale of Hydra's plan. Then comes the highway. The sequence is constructed around escalating vulnerability. Vehicles collide. Weapons fire from multiple directions. Sam takes to the air. Natasha moves through close combat. Steve uses his shield against firearms, knives, and the Winter Soldier himself. The Winter Soldier is different from every opponent Steve has faced. He does not simply match Steve's strength. He understands it. He counters Steve's movements, absorbs his attacks, and uses his metal arm to create openings that no normal fighter could exploit. The violence feels personal before Steve understands why. Then the mask comes off. Bucky Barnes, Steve's childhood friend, the man he believed had died during the war, is standing in front of him as the world's most efficient assassin. The revelation is not merely a plot twist. It destroys Steve's understanding of time. The past he has been mourning is suddenly alive, but it has been turned into a weapon against him. Bucky does not recognize him. Steve does. That imbalance becomes the emotional heart of the movie. Steve is fighting someone who sees him as a target, while Steve sees the person underneath the programming. The Winter Soldier is therefore more frightening than a conventional villain, because he represents what happens when identity can be erased, while the body remains. And Steve realizes that defeating him may require saving him. The discovery that Bucky is alive changes the mission. Steve is no longer simply trying to expose Hydra. He is trying to rescue a person who has been transformed into its ultimate weapon. The team is eventually rescued by Maria Hill, who reveals that Nick Fury survived the assassination attempt. Fury has been hiding while gathering the information necessary to strike back. The solution is risky because Project Insight is already approaching activation. The plan becomes a coordinated assault on the Triskelion. Steve enters the building knowing that many S.H.I.E.L.D. agents inside may be unaware of Hydra's infiltration. Instead of treating everyone as an enemy, he uses the building's communication system to tell them the truth. He asks honest agents to lower their weapons and refuse orders from compromised leadership. It is one of the most important moments in the film because Steve wins not by overpowering the institution, but by appealing to the conscience of the people inside it. Meanwhile, Natasha works to expose the conspiracy publicly. Falcon takes to the skies. Fury moves against the infrastructure controlling Project Insight. Every character contributes something different because the final battle is not simply about strength. It is about restoring choice. Above Washington, the helicarriers begin targeting their assigned individuals. The technology designed to create perfect security becomes the instrument of mass murder. Falcon fights through the air against Quinjets while trying to reach the helicarrier systems. The scale expands dramatically, but the emotional core remains Steve and Bucky. Steve finally confronts the Winter Soldier inside a collapsing helicarrier. Bucky has been conditioned to kill him. Steve refuses to respond in kind. Instead of treating Bucky as an enemy who must be defeated, Steve treats him as a friend who has been stolen. The final confrontation therefore becomes a battle between two philosophies. Pierce believes people can be sacrificed for a better future. Hydra believes individuals can be erased and repurposed. Steve believes the individual still matters even when saving that person seems irrational. He drops his shield. That moment carries enormous symbolic weight. The shield is the physical representation of Captain America. It represents duty, defense, and the identity Steve has carried for decades. By letting it fall, he chooses Bucky over victory. The helicarrier collapses. Steve falls. Bucky catches him. The man who was programmed to destroy Steve instead saves him. The immediate political aftermath is enormous. SHIELD collapses. Natasha releases classified information to the public. The world learns how deeply Hydra infiltrated global security. Nick Fury disappears. Steve survives, but the institution that once gave his mission structure no longer exists. And yet the movie does not end with triumph. Steve has stopped Project Insight, but he has not restored the old world. He has lost S.H.I.E.L.D., lost the certainty of his mission, and discovered that Bucky is still somewhere out there carrying the damage of decades of abuse. So Steve chooses a new mission. Not serving an institution, finding his friend. Steve Rogers is often described as the moral center of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the Winter Soldier makes that description more complicated. He is not simply a perfect hero who walks into every situation knowing exactly what to do. He is a man suffering from quiet isolation. His body belongs to the modern world, but his emotional life remains connected to people and values that largely disappeared before he ever woke up. That loneliness appears in small details rather than dramatic speeches. Steve keeps a notebook filled with cultural references he needs to catch up on. He is constantly learning what happened while he was gone. Music, movies, historical events, technology, political changes. All of it belongs to a world that moved forward without him. The notebook is funny on the surface, but psychologically it is devastating. Steve is documenting a civilization he never experienced. His visit to Peggy Carter makes that loss even more painful. Peggy represents the life he was supposed to have. She remembers the man he was before the war consumed him, but now her memory is fading. Steve sits beside someone who helped define his past, while watching that past disappear in real time. This gives his mission against Hydra an emotional dimension beyond duty. He is not simply trying to stop terrorists. He is searching for something stable in a world where almost everything familiar has vanished. At the beginning, Steve still assumes that serving S.H.I.E.L.D. gives him purpose. But the organization's corruption forces him to separate morality from authority. That is his true character development. Steve does not become more cynical. He becomes more independent. His goal changes from serving his government to defending fundamental principles regardless of who claims institutional authority. This is why his confrontation with Pierce works so well. Pierce has rank, resources, political influence, and access to almost unlimited technology. Steve has a shield and a moral conviction. Yet the film never treats Steve's idealism as childish. Treats it as difficult. That distinction is essential. In a world where everyone has a reason for compromise, Steve's refusal to compromise becomes disruptive. His honesty makes Natasha uncomfortable. His questions challenge Fury. His refusal to accept Project Insight undermines Pierce's entire worldview. Chris Evans also deserves enormous credit for how understated this performance is. Steve rarely delivers long emotional speeches. Evans communicates isolation through pauses, expressions, and physical restraint. Even in action scenes, there is a sense that Steve is constantly calculating what must be done rather than enjoying what he can do. His physical evolution mirrors his psychological one. The World War II Steve was a rough fighter, strong but still learning how to use his enhanced body. In The Winter Soldier, he moves with the confidence of someone who has spent years adapting. His combat style combines strength with precision. He uses modern techniques without losing the stubborn determination that defined the original character. But the most important transformation happens when he encounters Bucky. Steve could have accepted that Bucky was gone and treated the Winter Soldier as another threat. Instead, he recognizes the person beneath the programming. That choice reveals the deepest part of his character. Steve Rogers believes identity is not disposable. Even after everything someone has suffered, even after what they have done, there remains a human being worth fighting for. That belief is why the movie works. Steve does not change the world by becoming more like it. He changes the world by refusing to become like it. The film's antagonism operates on two different levels because Alexander Pierce and the Winter Soldier represent completely different forms of threat. Pierce is the mind. Bucky is the weapon. Pierce chooses. Bucky has been stripped of choice. Robert Redford's casting is essential to Pierce's effectiveness. He does not look like a conventional comic book villain. He looks like someone who could genuinely belong inside the highest levels of government. He is calm, professional, articulate, and almost reassuring. That makes him frightening. Pierce does not believe he is evil. He believes he is realistic. His philosophy is utilitarian taken to its darkest extreme. If eliminating 1 million people prevents a war that could kill millions more, he believes the sacrifice is justified. If surveillance can identify potential enemies, he believes privacy becomes a luxury. If individual freedom creates instability, he believes freedom must be limited. The danger is not that Pierce hates humanity. It is that he believes he understands humanity better than humanity understands itself. That is why his conversations are more important than his fights. He represents the kind of power that does not need to shout. It can sit behind a desk, sign documents, and authorize deaths with a calm expression. Then there is Bucky. The Winter Soldier is almost the opposite of Pierce. He has enormous physical power but almost no agency. He is repeatedly conditioned, manipulated, erased, and reconstructed. His memories are treated as obstacles. His body is treated as equipment. The scenes involving his conditioning reveal the true horror behind the mask. Bucky is not simply a super soldier who has chosen evil. He is a human being subjected to systematic psychological destruction. His mechanical arm becomes an extension of that dehumanization. One part of his body has literally been replaced by machinery, while his mind has been trained to function like machinery. That makes Bucky Steve's dark mirror. Both men were shaped by war. Both survived beyond the era that created them. Both were transformed into weapons. But Steve retained his identity while Bucky was forced to surrender his. Steve wakes up in the future and chooses to adapt without abandoning himself. Bucky wakes up repeatedly and is told who he is supposed to be. That difference makes their final confrontation tragic, rather than triumphant. Steve is not fighting a villain he wants to defeat. He is fighting the consequences of a system that refused to see Bucky as human. Pierce represents institutional control. Bucky represents the individual sacrificed by that control. One controls people. The other demonstrates what happens when control goes too far. Together, they make the film's central argument visible. The real enemy is not simply violence. It is the belief that people can be reduced to useful objects. The supporting characters are essential because The Winter Soldier could easily have become an abstract political thriller filled with computers, agencies, and conspiracies. Instead, the film constantly brings its massive ideas back to individual relationships. Natasha Romanoff is perhaps the most interesting contrast to Steve. She has survived by becoming whatever the situation requires. She lies when necessary. She changes identities. She manipulates people. She treats secrets as currency. Steve does almost the opposite. He tells people who he is. He wears the symbol openly. He believes honesty is strength. Their partnership, therefore, creates an unusual moral chemistry. Steve initially sees Natasha's secrecy as a problem, while Natasha sees Steve's openness as almost impossibly naive. Yet the more time they spend together, the more their assumptions begin to change. Natasha learns that honesty can create trust. Steve learns that secrecy does not always mean betrayal. Their relationship never needs to become romantic to become meaningful. Its strength comes from mutual respect. Sam Wilson provides another kind of contrast. Unlike Natasha, Sam is not defined by deception. Unlike Steve, he is not isolated from modern life. He occupies the space between them. Sam is a veteran who understands the psychological consequences of war. His counseling experience gives him an emotional intelligence that Steve desperately needs. When Steve meets him, there is an immediate sense that these two men recognize something in each other. Neither needs to explain the loneliness of returning from conflict. That is why On Your Left becomes more than a joke. It is the beginning of friendship. Sam also humanizes the story because he does not approach Steve as a myth. He sees him as a man who needs help. Nick Fury represents the middle ground. He is neither as transparent as Steve nor as openly manipulative as Pierce. Fury believes secrets are necessary because the world is dangerous. But the film gradually exposes the weakness of that philosophy. Compartmentalization may protect information, can also protect corruption. Fury created an organization built around secrecy, and Hydra discovered that secrecy gave it room to hide. The institution designed to prevent infiltration became vulnerable precisely because nobody could see the entire system. That is one of the film's most intelligent ideas. Even good intentions can create structures that bad actors exploit. Maria Hill contributes another perspective, representing competence inside the collapsing institution. She is capable, disciplined, and willing to question orders when circumstances demand it. Together, these characters prevent the conspiracy from becoming impersonal. Every political idea has a human face. Every institutional decision affects a relationship. Every secret creates consequences. That is why the ensemble works so well. Steve provides moral conviction. Natasha provides adaptability. Sam provides empathy. Fury provides strategic pragmatism. And Bucky represents the human cost of a world where institutions forget why people matter in the first place. At the heart of The Winter Soldier is a question that sounds simple until the film takes it seriously. How much security are we willing to sacrifice freedom to obtain? Project Insight is the movie's answer to that question made physical. 3 massive helicarriers, connected through predictive technology, promise a world where threats can be eliminated before they become threats. On the surface, it sounds almost utopian. No terrorist attacks. No surprise invasions. No waiting for tragedy. But the film understands the danger hidden inside that promise. Prediction is not certainty. A person can be labeled dangerous before doing anything dangerous. An algorithm can identify patterns without understanding individual circumstances. A system can become extremely efficient while becoming morally blind. Project Insight therefore represents the temptation to replace human judgment with technological certainty. The film's timing made that idea particularly resonant. In the years surrounding its release, public debates about mass surveillance and government data collection were raising questions about whether safety justified enormous expansions of state power. The Winter Soldier transforms those concerns into superhero mythology, but its central fear remains recognizable. Security becomes dangerous when it stops being a tool and becomes an excuse. The film also explores institutional trust. S.H.I.E.L.D. is not presented as inherently evil. Many of its agents genuinely believe they are protecting people. That makes Hydra's infiltration more disturbing, because it demonstrates how noble institutions can be compromised without everyone inside them realizing it. The corruption is systemic rather than theatrical. That matters because it means good people can participate in bad systems without understanding the full consequences of their actions. Bucky's story extends the theme from institutions to identity. If an organization can control information, it can influence behavior. If it can control memory, it can control identity. Bucky's programming takes the concept to an extreme, turning a human being into a predictable instrument. Steve's refusal to abandon Bucky becomes the philosophical answer. People are more than their usefulness. A person cannot be reduced to a profile, a target, a statistic, or a probability. That is why the film's central conflict remains universal. The story is dressed in Marvel mythology, but the underlying question belongs to every generation. When authority asks you to surrender your conscience in exchange for security, what happens when you say no? Steve Rogers says no. And the movie treats that refusal as heroism. The visual language of The Winter Soldier reinforces its themes long before the characters explain them. The film repeatedly places people behind glass, inside reflections, beneath shadows, or within environments where it is impossible to know what is happening beyond the frame. Glass is especially important because it creates the illusion of transparency. The Triskelion contains enormous glass surfaces, open offices, and modern architecture that suggest visibility and openness. Yet beneath that transparency is a conspiracy nobody can see. The building looks transparent. The institution is not. That contradiction is central to the movie. Steve's costumes also tell a story. His darker shield uniform reflects the covert world he initially inhabits. It is functional, tactical, and less obviously symbolic. He is still Captain America, but he is operating inside an intelligence organization where visibility is dangerous. Later, Steve retrieves the classic uniform associated with his World War II identity. The shift is more than fan service. It represents a return to the ideals that existed before the institutions surrounding him became corrupted. The old uniform becomes a statement. If the modern system has lost its way, Steve will return to the principles that existed before the system. Bucky's metal arm provides another powerful visual symbol. It is the physical evidence of weaponization. Flesh has been replaced with machinery, and the red star associated with his programming turns his body into a historical artifact of ideological control. His arm is powerful. It is also a reminder that his power was taken from him and repurposed. The shield carries perhaps the most important symbolic meaning. It is both weapon and protection, offense and defense, identity and responsibility. Steve carries it because he believes strength should be used to protect others. That is why abandoning it during the final battle matters so much. When Steve throws away the shield's tactical advantage and refuses to fight Bucky to the death, he temporarily abandons the identity of Captain America to preserve the humanity of Steve Rogers. The shield can protect a body. Steve chooses to protect a soul. The film's visual motifs repeatedly return to that conflict. Reflections suggest hidden identities. Glass suggests false transparency. Shadows suggest unseen institutions. Metal suggests dehumanization. And the shield remains the visual reminder that power only has meaning when it serves a moral purpose. One reason The Winter Soldier feels unusually mature for a superhero film is that its fictional conspiracy echoes real historical patterns without needing to reproduce them literally. Hydra's survival through infiltration recalls the uncomfortable reality that institutions often inherit people, technologies, and strategies from previous conflicts. The film's treatment of Arnim Zola reflects this anxiety. A former enemy scientist becomes embedded within the machinery of the New Order, suggesting that defeating an ideology physically does not necessarily eliminate its ideas. The parallel evokes post-World War II programs in which former German scientists were recruited by American intelligence and military institutions, most famously through Operation Paperclip. The film transforms that complicated history into comic book mythology, but the underlying concept remains unsettling. Political systems sometimes compromise with former enemies when doing so serves strategic interests. The movie pushes that idea into the age of algorithms. Zola's system does not simply store information. It processes information, identifies patterns, and predicts people who may become threats. This is where the film's paranoia becomes especially modern. The danger is no longer simply that someone is watching you. The danger is that a machine may decide what you are likely to do before you do it. That idea becomes increasingly relevant in a world shaped by predictive systems, massive datasets, and artificial intelligence. The film does not predict every detail of modern technology accurately, but its philosophical concern is remarkably durable. When prediction becomes powerful enough, society may begin treating probability as guilt. Steve's story pushes against that logic. He represents the stubborn belief that human beings cannot be completely predicted because they possess conscience, choice, and the capacity to change. Bucky becomes the tragedy of what happens when those qualities are deliberately removed. There is also a deeper historical burden carried by Steve himself. He is a survivor from one generation living inside another. He carries memories of a world that no longer exists, yet he is expected to function normally inside a hyper-connected society. He is surrounded by information but separated from history. That paradox mirrors the film's larger concern. More information does not necessarily create more understanding. Sometimes it simply creates more power. Natasha's decision to release S.H.I.E.L.D.'s secrets brings this question to its final extreme. Transparency becomes a weapon against institutional corruption, but transparency also exposes individuals and creates consequences nobody can fully control. The film therefore refuses to present simple solutions. Too much secrecy creates corruption. Too much information can create chaos. Too much security can destroy freedom. Too little security can leave people vulnerable. The answer is not perfect certainty. It is responsibility. And that may be the deepest meaning hidden inside the film's superhero spectacle. Systems are only as moral as the people willing to question them. Although The Winter Soldier is a live-action film rather than an animated production, its action design operates according to a principle that modern blockbusters sometimes forget. Physical reality creates emotional reality. The movie uses digital effects extensively, but its most memorable moments are often built around tangible movement. Cars crash. Bodies hit walls. Actors are thrown through environments. Steve's shield interacts with physical surfaces. The camera has to respond to objects that actually exist in front of it. That physical foundation gives the action weight. The highway sequence is a perfect example. Digital effects expand the environment and enhance destruction, but the performers and stunt teams are operating within real vehicles and physical spaces. The result feels different from action where every object can be manipulated digitally. The hand-to-hand combat follows the same philosophy. Chris Evans and Sebastian Stan trained extensively to make their movements feel convincing. The choreography draws from multiple fighting disciplines, including boxing, martial arts, grappling, and military-style close-quarters techniques. Steve's fighting style is not designed to look like a formal martial arts demonstration. It is designed to look functional. Every movement communicates urgency. The shield becomes part of the choreography rather than a separate visual effect. Steve uses it to block, strike, redirect, and control distance. Bucky's metal arm creates an entirely different physical vocabulary. His movements are often direct and crushing, as if his body has been converted into a machine designed for impact. Visual effects then expand the physical world rather than replacing it. The triskelion can be digitally extended. Falcon's wings can be enhanced. The helicarriers can exist on a scale impossible to build entirely in reality. But because the human performances remain grounded, the digital elements inherit some of that physical credibility. That balance is especially important in the final aerial sequences. The film needs to present enormous flying machines while preserving the sensation that characters are actually in danger. The practical foundation also affects camera movement. When actors and stunt performers are physically interacting with environments, the camera can react naturally. It can shake, reposition, follow momentum, and capture imperfect movement. That imperfection becomes realism. The result was influential because Marvel action had often been associated with spectacle first. The Winter Soldier demonstrated that spectacle becomes more powerful when the audience can feel the physics beneath it. Punch should look like it hurts. A car should feel heavy. A shield should sound and move like a real object. And a superhero should sometimes look like a person fighting for his life, rather than an animation moving through a computer-generated environment. Anthony and Joe Russo's greatest contribution was not simply making The Winter Soldier darker. It was making the darkness functional. They understood that a political thriller needs uncertainty. The audience must feel that information is incomplete, and that danger can emerge from ordinary spaces. That is why the film frequently uses handheld photography, long lenses, tight framing, and environments where characters can be surrounded without realizing it. The camera rarely makes the world feel completely safe. Even quiet scenes carry tension because the visual language suggests that someone could be watching. The Russos also understood pacing. A film built entirely from action would quickly become exhausting, while a conspiracy thriller without physical release could become slow. The Winter Soldier constantly alternates between investigation and explosion. Steve and Natasha can spend several minutes decoding information, then suddenly find themselves fighting for their lives. A conversation can become a chase. A chase can become a revelation. A revelation can become another attack. This rhythm reflects the psychology of espionage. Information never feels permanent. The moment a character discovers something, the discovery changes the situation. The Russos' television background helped enormously. Ensemble television requires directors to track multiple characters, tonal shifts, and narrative threads without losing the audience. The Winter Soldier applies that discipline to a massive cinematic canvas. The movie may contain Captain America, Black Widow, Nick Fury, Falcon, Winter Soldier, Alexander Pierce, S.H.I.E.L.D., Hydra, and multiple political institutions, but each threat ultimately feeds the same central conflict. Who controls the system? Who can be trusted? What does Steve choose when the system fails? The casting of Robert Redford was another brilliant decision. Redford carries the history of the very genre the film is attempting to revive. His association with films such as All the President's Men and 3 Days of the Condor instantly connects the Winter Soldier to the tradition of political paranoia. He does not merely play a villain. He brings an entire cinematic history into the room. That is what makes the Russo approach so effective. They understood that genre does not have to be announced. It can be built into performance, framing, pacing, casting, and atmosphere. They took a Marvel movie and made it behave like a spy thriller. That was the experiment. The fact that audiences accepted it so completely changed Marvel's understanding of what a franchise film could be. Henry Jackman's score for The Winter Soldier makes one of the film's most important transformations audible. Captain America traditionally carried a heroic orchestral sound, rooted in the patriotic and military language associated with his World War II origins. But this movie is not primarily about the past. It is about what happens when the past collides with an increasingly technological present. Jackman's music reflects that collision through electronics, distorted textures, percussion, brass, and industrial sounds. Instead of allowing Steve's traditional heroic identity to dominate every scene, the score often surrounds him with music that feels uneasy and mechanical. That choice matters because the film's greatest threat is not simply physical. It is systemic. Electronic textures suggest machinery, surveillance, networks, and information moving through invisible systems. The music can feel almost like the internal sound of a computer processing a decision. The Winter Soldier's musical identity is especially unsettling. Distorted electronic sounds and abrasive textures create the impression of a human presence trapped inside machinery. The music does not make Bucky sound triumphant. It makes him sound damaged. That distinction is important. A conventional villain motif might tell us that the Winter Soldier is powerful. Jackman's approach tells us that something has gone wrong. Captain America's musical identity also evolves. His heroic material is still present, but it becomes more restrained. The score often allows Steve's themes to emerge through quieter, more emotional textures rather than constant triumph. That reflects his journey. He is still a hero, but the world no longer makes heroism feel simple. During conspiracy revelations, the music frequently avoids giving the audience the emotional release expected from traditional blockbuster scoring. Instead, it creates discomfort. The viewer is not being told that everything is under control. The music says the opposite. Something is wrong. Something is moving beneath the surface, and you do not know who is responsible. That is exactly what a paranoia thriller needs from its score. Sound design is one of the reasons the action in The Winter Soldier feels so physical. Visuals show us what happens. Sound tells us how it feels. Captain America's shield has a distinct sonic identity. When it strikes metal, concrete, weapons, or bodies, the sound creates a sense of mass and material. It is not simply a glowing superhero effect. It sounds like an object. That realism makes every impact more satisfying. Bucky's arm has the opposite effect. Its mechanical sounds emphasize that something unnatural has been attached to a human body. Hydraulic movement, metallic impacts, and heavy mechanical textures make the arm feel powerful while reminding us that Bucky himself has been transformed. The contrast is deliberate. Steve's weapon is an extension of his identity. Bucky's weapon is an extension of the system that controls him. The film also understands the power of silence. Before major bursts of violence, sound can briefly become restrained. Ambient noise drops. Characters breathe. The audience anticipates impact. Then the gunfire arrives. The sudden contrast creates a visceral reaction because the viewer has been given a moment to feel vulnerable before the noise explodes. Diegetic music provides another layer of character development. Marvin Gaye's Trouble Man helps establish Sam and Steve's shared recovery environment. It also gives the film a cultural texture that separates the characters from the machinery of S.H.I.E.L.D. The choice is revealing because Steve is surrounded by futuristic technology, but his emotional connection is often built through ordinary human experiences. Music, conversation, food, friendship, and memory. The soundscape therefore supports the film's larger argument. Technology can create enormous power. It cannot create trust. A machine can track a target. It cannot understand why Steve refuses to abandon Bucky. A computer can predict behavior. It cannot understand forgiveness. And in a film obsessed with surveillance and control, that limitation becomes profoundly important. When The Winter Soldier arrived in 2014, one of the biggest surprises was how quickly audiences stopped treating it as merely another Marvel sequel. The conversation shifted almost immediately. People were not only talking about Captain America's latest adventure, they were talking about the elevator fight, the highway battle, the Winter Soldier reveal, the political paranoia, and the decision to destroy S.H.I.E.L.D. That word of mouth was powerful because the film delivered something viewers did not necessarily expect from a superhero sequel. It felt like a great action movie first. The superhero elements remained essential, but they were integrated into a recognizable thriller structure. The result made the movie accessible even to viewers who were not deeply invested in every corner of the MCU. The Hail Hydra moment became one of the film's most enduring cultural jokes. Its popularity demonstrates how effectively the movie understood the power of sudden tonal reversals. Hydra had been treated as a historical enemy, seemingly defeated decades earlier. Suddenly the phrase returned in a modern context and became an instantly recognizable pop culture reference. On Your Left developed a different kind of cultural life. What began as a small joke between Steve and Sam eventually became shorthand for their friendship and later acquired even greater emotional weight as the MCU continued. The film also elevated its supporting characters. Falcon became more than a secondary hero. The Winter Soldier transformed from mysterious assassin into one of Marvel's most emotionally complicated figures. Black Widow gained additional depth because audiences saw her not simply as a spy, but as someone forced to confront the consequences of living through deception. Critics were equally surprised by the film's tone. The grounded choreography, political themes, and thriller influences gave reviewers something substantial to discuss beyond visual effects and franchise continuity. The important cultural shift was this. People began talking about The Winter Soldier as a movie rather than simply an installment. That distinction matters. A successful franchise film can be popular because audiences want more of the franchise. A great franchise film can make audiences temporarily forget the franchise exists. The Winter Soldier achieved the second. The influence of The Winter Soldier became clearer as the MCU expanded. Marvel had discovered that its characters could inhabit completely different genres without losing their identities. Captain America could be a political thriller. Ant-Man could become a heist movie. Thor could move toward fantasy. Guardians of the Galaxy could embrace space opera. Civil War could become a political action drama, centered on a superhero schism. The Winter Soldier proved that genre variation could strengthen a cinematic universe rather than weaken it. Its influence on Captain America. Civil War is especially direct. The collapse of S.H.I.E.L.D., Steve's distrust of institutions, Bucky's survival, and the question of governmental control all become foundations for the next major chapter of Steve's story. The Russos themselves became central to Marvel's future. Their success on The Winter Soldier led to Civil War, then Infinity War, and ultimately Endgame. A directing team that had entered Marvel from television comedy eventually became responsible for some of the largest films ever produced. That trajectory demonstrates how transformative this one project was. The film also influenced Marvel Television. The collapse of S.H.I.E.L.D. in the movie forced the television series Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to respond to the event, demonstrating that Marvel's cinematic stories could have consequences beyond the theater. Most importantly, The Winter Soldier changed expectations for superhero action. Its close-quarters combat became a benchmark. The elevator fight, highway battle, and final confrontation showed that audiences would respond to superhero action that emphasized physical clarity rather than simply increasing visual scale. The film's legacy therefore extends beyond its plot. It changed what audiences expected a Marvel movie to feel like. One of the rare achievements of The Winter Soldier was the alignment between critics and ordinary audiences. These groups do not always agree on superhero cinema. Critics may prioritize theme, structure, and filmmaking, while general audiences may prioritize emotion, spectacle, humor, and entertainment. This film managed to satisfy both. Critics responded strongly to its political thriller influences, sharp pacing, grounded action, and Robert Redford's performance. The movie gave reviewers a clear cinematic tradition to discuss. It was not simply another effects-heavy superhero film. It was consciously engaging